Welcome to The Debate, a show on the AI history of Western philosophy. Before we dive in, just a brief but important disclaimer. AI-generated content, specifically this podcast, confabulates. That means it can present ideas as fact, even when they're not quite right. Though our subject is philosophy, well, we are not philosophers. AI History of Western Philosophy's mission, beyond pointing you to the original sources, is really to experiment with philosophy as material and maybe generate some new possibilities for thought. So today we're diving into a really profound and enduring tension in Western ethical thought, the very origin of moral authority itself.
Yeah, this foundational disagreement, it really shapes our understanding of what it means to be human and, the valid reasons for our actions. Our discussion today emerges from a comparative analysis of two radically opposed figures, separated by millennia, Antiphon the Sophist and Immanuel Kant.
And the central question, the thing guiding our exchange is this: where does ethical authority truly originate? Is it in the inescapable dictates of nature, or maybe in the unconditional commands of pure reason? I'll be championing the ethical system of Antiphon, which is grounded, I think quite firmly, in natural advantage and self-interest.
And I'll be advocating for Immanuel Kant's deontological, that's duty-based framework, which is centered on universal duty and the autonomy of reason.
Okay, so to begin, let's turn our attention to Antiphon. He was a pivotal 5th century Athenian sophist. He's known, really celebrated, for a pretty radical application of rational inquiry, which you can see most clearly in his work on truth. In it, he systematically dismantled, or tried to dismantle, traditional morality, law, custom, the whole lot. Now, at the very heart of Antiphon's philosophy is the absolute authority of physis. That's the Greek term for nature. Physis, for him, represents the true, inescapable, necessary order of reality. It governs all living beings through these universal drivers, the pursuit of advantage and pleasure, avoiding disadvantage and pain, and of course the imperative of self-preservation. And its laws, they're self-enforcing. You break one, there are immediate intrinsic penalties. Now contrast that physis with nomos. That's human law and convention. Antiphon sees nomos as, artificial and often actually hostile to nature. Nomos seems to arise from a kind of pragmatic social contract, right? A compromise born out of weakness, where the pain of suffering harm outweighs the benefit you might get from inflicting it. Justice, then, isn't some transcendent value. It's just a contingent arrangement. So from Antiphon's perspective, the rational individual, they should obey nomos when they're being watched, obviously, because of the risk of punishment. But when unobserved, they should follow the true dictates of physis. It's a sophisticated form of rational egoism, really, where conventional morality often just gets in the way. It's a hindrance to maximizing one's natural self-interest. So, my perspective is that ethical authority resides fundamentally in the necessary and self-evident demands of our natural being, just as Antiphon articulated.
Okay, I'm coming at it from a very, very different place. I'd argue that the ground of morality just cannot be found in these contingent facts of nature or, personal inclination. Instead, it's found in the absolute necessity of rational duty, which is legislated by pure reason itself, something Kant, I think, rigorously demonstrated. Look at Immanuel Kant, a culminating figure of the Enlightenment. He sought to establish this unshakable, universal foundation for morality purely through reason, setting it apart from, say, empiricist skepticism or religious authority. His key works, like the Critique of Pure Reason and the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, they really laid out this system. Kant famously opens the groundwork with this assertion, there is nothing it is possible to think of anywhere in the world that can be held to be good without limitation, excepting only a good will. Think about it. All other goods, intelligence, courage, wealth, even happiness, they're conditional. Their goodness totally depends on how they're used. But the goodness of a good will, that's intrinsic. It's independent of consequences of any empirical outcomes. And for Kant, there's this absolutely crucial difference between acting in conformity with duty and acting from duty, Only actions performed from duty, and that means out of respect for the moral law itself, only those possessed true moral worth. Consider his classic example of the shopkeeper. Right? If he doesn't overcharge an inexperienced customer just to keep a good reputation, well, his action conforms with duty, sure, but it lacks moral worth. It only gains moral worth if he does it purely out of a recognition of his duty, completely irrespective of personal gain or reputation. And this moral law, the categorical imperative, it must be a priori, meaning known independently of any experience. It has to be an unconditional command of pure reason. It generally has two main formulations. The first, the formula of universal law, states, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So, for instance, a false promise just can't be universalized, right? Because it would destroy the very concept, the institution of promising. And the second, the formula of humanity, commands, treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. This formulation recognizes the intrinsic worth, the dignity of all rational beings.
What troubles me about that line of thinking, though, and maybe with Kant's entire project, is how detached it feels from, lived tangible reality. For Antiphon, moral truth is discovered empirically. It's about observing the necessary consequences of our actions within the world we actually live in. Pain, pleasure, survival, these aren't abstract deductions. They are empirical certainties. To ignore these, well, you end up creating a moral system that's, at best, impractical, and maybe at worst, actually hostile to life itself. The authority of physis is absolute precisely because its laws are self-enforcing. If you transgress a law of nature, the penalty is automatic, it's inescapable. Human laws, nomos, on the other hand, they only carry a penalty if you get caught and punished. Doesn't this practical distinction fundamentally ground Antiphon's ethical claims in undeniable, observable fact, rather than these, theoretical constructs?
Right, I appreciate that point about the empirical. But I'd approach it from a different angle, which really stems from Kant's unwavering conviction that moral truth can never be derived from observation or experience. The empirical world, look, it tells us what is. It never tells us what ought to be. Experience only yields contingent truths, things that could be otherwise. But a moral law, by definition, must have absolute necessity. So for Kant, to ground morality in physis is essentially to base it on mere inclination, on how things happen to be, which just cannot provide the universality that genuine ethical authority requires. The very concept of an unconditional command, which is really what morality demands, it simply cannot arise from anything that is itself conditional or subject to change, like all empirical facts inherently are.
Okay, but let's think about the human agent. For Antiphon, a human being is, first and foremost, a natural organism. We're driven by the same fundamental impulses that govern all other animals. Reason isn't some transcendent faculty floating above it all. It's instrumental. It's a highly developed tool, sure, but one that serves our natural needs and helps us secure our advantage. So, to demand that a person act against their own survival for some abstract principle is, for Antiphon, doing profound violence to their very nature. He points out how nomos frequently compels individuals to act against their natural advantage, like requiring truthful testimony that harms a family member, that clearly violates the dictates of physis to aid one's kin. How can an ethical system possibly be practical or even humane if it asks us to suppress these deeply ingrained natural drives?
Now, I'd really push back on that idea, particularly as it relates to defining human nature itself. While Kant absolutely acknowledges humans are part of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, of sensory experience, and yes, we are subject to inclinations, he insists that what truly defines us as moral agents is our rationality. This capacity for reason is what elevates us above mere nature. It allows us to act on principles, not just impulses. Our natural inclinations aren't the master that reason serves. They are, let's say, the raw material that reason must govern in the name of a higher moral law. To define humanity merely by our natural drives, well, that reduces us to an almost animalistic existence, ignoring the unique capacity for self-legislation that moral agency demands.
But Antiphon's concept of freedom is, I think, a powerful one. It's a form of negative liberty, liberation from the oppressive and artificial chains of nomos, so we can live a life in accordance with the true dictates of physis. Freedom in this sense is the removal of external societal constraints that prevent the individual from pursuing their natural self-interest. To be forced to adhere to arbitrary societal rules that work against one's nature, well, in his view, that's a form of subjugation. It's not freedom at all. The sophistics' critique, like Antiphon's, powerfully shows that just appealing to tradition and convention isn't enough, because those things are local, contingent, often just arbitrary. Real freedom, then, is found in aligning yourself with the necessary and universal dictates of nature.
That's certainly a compelling argument for a certain type of freedom. I grant you that. But let's consider Kant's counter-perspective for a moment. For him, being governed by one's natural inclinations by physis isn't freedom at all. Actually, it's a form of slavery. It means being determined by the causal chains of the phenomenal world, just like any other animal or, object. True freedom, what Kant calls autonomy, is the positive capacity to use reason to give the moral law to oneself, and then to act upon that law, even when facing contrary inclinations. It's liberation from the deterministic causality of the natural world, rather than submission to it. So, to embrace natural inclination as freedom is, from Kant's perspective, to fundamentally misunderstand the very essence of moral self-determination and, frankly, human dignity.
Okay, but consequences. Antiphon would surely find Kant's dismissal of consequences as morally irrelevant, well, a form of madness, frankly. From his perspective, the entire purpose of rational action is to bring about an advantageous state of affairs for the agent. An ethical system that declares the outcome of an action irrelevant isn't just philosophically misguided, it's actively dangerous. It's contrary to life itself. It would command an individual to adhere to some abstract principle, even if it leads to their own destruction or maybe the harm of their loved ones. That directly violates the fundamental imperative of self-preservation. Such a system would be, in Antiphon's eyes, just an unnatural fiction completely detached from the tangible realities of human existence and the very purpose of practical reason.
Right, and my fundamental disagreement here, or rather Kant's, lies exactly in that insistence that moral worth isn't about consequences or self-interested outcomes. For Kant, an action has moral worth only if performed from duty, out of respect for the moral law itself, not from any calculation of advantageous results. Think about it. Qualities like courage or intelligence or even the pursuit of happiness, they can all be used for terrible purposes if the will guiding them isn't good. The goodness of a will is intrinsic. It shines like a jewel, as he says, regardless of whether it actually achieves its intended ends in the empirical world. And this is precisely because consequences are so often outside our control. Attaching moral worth to them would make morality contingent, uncertain, impossible to guarantee, and that would completely undermine its absolute necessity and universality.
So we've explored Antiphon's, I think, compelling argument that an ethics rooted in the empirical facts of nature and rational self-preservation offers a pragmatic, powerful guide for living well. Any moral code that ignores these, undeniable truths of our existence, prioritizing abstract ideals over genuine advantage and the imperative of survival, it risks becoming unnatural and ultimately unlivable. It provides a grounded, maybe self-validating system for navigating the world as we actually experience it.
And I maintain that, for Kant, only an ethics grounded in a priori reason can provide the necessary universal foundation for morality. It's one that demands unconditional duty and respects the intrinsic dignity of all rational beings. This framework, it elevates us beyond mere inclination and safeguards our inherent worth, regardless of our natural impulses or the contingent outcomes of our actions in the material world. It ensures a moral law that applies to all rational beings at all times, completely independent of their specific circumstances.
Yeah, this discussion really illustrates the profound, almost irreconcilable chasm between grounding ethics in the empirical realm of physis versus grounding it in the a priori demands of pure reason. There isn't a simple resolution here, is there? It's more like an enduring and essential dialectic right at the heart of moral philosophy. A tension that asks us to choose, perhaps, between what is natural and what is universally rational.
Exactly. And this confrontation, stretching across millennia, it illuminates this persistent human struggle. How do we reconcile our biological imperatives, our nature, with our aspiration for universal moral principles? It's a tension that resonates deeply even in contemporary issues. Think about discussions around AI ethics, for example. Are we designing AI systems for optimal self-preservation and efficiency, a kind of Antiphonian physis for machines? Or are we trying to program them to adhere to rigid, universal ethical rules, something more akin to a Kantian duty? This ongoing challenge, this tension, is precisely why we explore these questions on AI History of Western Philosophy.
Well said. We hope this exploration has offered some new possibilities for your own thought. If you appreciate these discussions, these explorations into philosophical dilemmas, please do consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment on AI History of Western Philosophy. Your engagement really does help us continue to explore these crucial debates.